Welcome to Paranormal Heart Podcast, a pre-recorded show streaming on UPRN 107.7 FM in New Orleans. I'm your host, Kat Ward. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you want to help support the show, please hit that like button, share, and subscribe. You can also find Paranormal Heart merch on TeePublic. The link will be in the show notes. So my special guest tonight for my Halloween episode is a dear friend who I call my paranormal sister, JJROSE777. Tonight, JJ will be discussing the Salem Witch Trials and how she's descended from one of the accused witches during those times. I'm pretty excited. So, without further ado, whoops, I'm having technical issues here. So sorry. Without further ado, I bring you JJ Rose. Hello, JJ.
Hello, Kat. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. It's so nice to see you.
Same. Long time.
I know, it has been a long time.
It has.
Yeah. So for those of you who have listened to past episodes, JJ and I are part of what we call the Fantastic Five with 3 other podcasters. So, she is my paranormal sister.
Indeed.
Lots to talk about, JJ.
A lot, girl. There's a lot. So first of all, happy Halloween, everyone.
Happy Halloween.
Yay. It's the most wonderful time of the year. So Kat, you were really interested in this episode and what I found out about my family tree, which makes a lot of sense now that I understand it with history. So why don't you tell me where you want me to start?
Well, if you could start giving the listeners and viewers just a little bit of a background on you, just to introduce yourself, and then we can get into the Halloween side.
Sure. So I am a psychic energy entity cleaner and clearer, which is a nice way to say I do exorcisms. I remove attachments, help people tune and clear their energy fields. Mainly, though, I'm a metaphysical teacher. I have a YouTube channel, and basically I put in playlists a little bit for everyone, people who are just having spiritual awakenings, people who are more advanced. Definitely a playlist for people who want to have hands-on things that you can do that are free to enhance your own spiritual protection, self-healing work, all the things. I even have a little channel for paranormal investigators, kind of give them some tips. I also am a psychic specialist for a paranormal investigating group. I wear many, many hats. I am also a white witch. I am also an ordained minister. I am a lot.
You are a lot. And I have to say, you don't just clear the nasty energy, you nuke them, because it has been mentioned on past episodes on my show and on some other podcasts that people who are in the same room as you, when you clear out these nasty energies, they can feel almost like a nuclear bomb went off.
I put out a lot of heat when I'm working. So, my hair looks nice right now, but I have the AC to sub-zero, basically, to keep it that way. But there are times when I'm doing this where even remotely, I've worked with people in other countries where they physically feel warm when I'm working. Couple people feel the opposite. They feel cold. It just depends on your sensitivity and how you sense things. But I love the work that I get to do. I love working with other people, seeing them grow and develop. That's really what makes me excited and happy.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing what you do. It's not for the lighthearted, definitely.
Yes.
Yeah. So Halloween and the Salem Witch Trials. What do you have for us?
Oh, I've got so much. Okay. So let me take you all back a little bit first and let you know why I'm even talking about this. I'm not a historian, by the way. I am just someone who does a lot of research into history. It's one of my passions. So here I am years ago. I'm watching the History Channel. It's October, right? So they're putting on all the different specials that they have about the Salem Witch Trials. And all of a sudden I see this man go to this gravesite, and he's asking forgiveness from this person who was hung at the Salem Witch Trial because he's an ancestor of one of the accusers. And he felt that the connection and not getting forgiveness from his generational line was causing him to be cursed or bad luck, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. So they get to the gravestone and he says her name, Elizabeth Howe. And I have this moment where I'm like, wait a minute, I'm a direct descendant from the Howes. I wonder if, because I don't know that much about my family's history. It wasn't really talked about. And also, my grandpa was Canadian. So I didn't even know that we had
Canada.
Right? So I didn't even know that we had, American blood. Plus, going back that far, it was never discussed. It was never talked about. So fine. So I look it up to see, was Elizabeth Howe, connected to the relative that I know I'm related to? And yeah, it was her grandson.
Wow.
So I'm a direct descendant from her. And I can remember being in junior high and they were talking about the Salem Witch Trials in history class. And I was so incensed at what happened. Mind you, I'm like 12, okay? And I'm so angry. I had to get up and leave class because I had a moment. And I was a little dramatic, but not that dramatic that I would get up and interrupt class because, I'm just done with things. And I did. And I was so frustrated at how people could be so awful, but also how they could take evidence from 9 to 12-year-old children and kill people as a result. And this led to just kind of this lifelong love of justice, but also really wanting to defend those who are falsely accused and set the record straight for history's sake. So that's a little background into who I am and why I'm even talking about any of this to begin with. So like I said, fast forward all these years later, and here I'm a full-grown adult and I find out I'm a direct descendant of one of the people, and I'm like, oh, that explains why that generational trauma, when it got brought up when I was younger, I was so angry at it and have been ever since. So I decided to deep dive a little bit just because I wanted to know a little more about my own family history. And I have to tell you, I'm really proud to be descended from this woman because she was incredible. But before I get into all of that, I need to paint a picture for you because it's very hard in today's world that we live in to comprehend how this occurred in the first place. So let's go back to the 1600s in the Americas, which they were the Americas back then. It wasn't America. And these pilgrims had come over. They came over from England because England and their religion, Christianity in England under the king, that was not dogmatic and Christian enough for them. So these people were die-hard religious and they wanted a fresh start. So they come over to the New World on the boats and they basically get here and have to all of a sudden figure out that we're not familiar with this land. Nothing about this place makes sense. There's rocks in the soil. There's trees everywhere. We have to clear it. It's a lot of hard labor, very intense hard labor. And you've already been on a ship for 6 months, right? Like sailing over here. And now you get here and you're immediately put to work, those who made it. And now you have diseases. They start meeting with the native people who were already in the area. I think if you know anything about history, that didn't go well.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of wars. There was a lot of trauma. There were a lot of savage, brutal invasions on both sides of the coin. It was the native people as well as these Puritans, and they would attack each other. I mean, they would do it in the middle of the night while kids were sleeping. It was bad. So there's a lot of orphans as well. Now, in the Puritan religion itself, the Bible is it. But besides the Bible is literal, everything you did had to be to serve God. So there was no fun allowed, basically. There was no enjoyment in the things that men and women do in private. Their children were not allowed to have fun. They weren't allowed to sing songs unless they were hymns for God and for church.
Mm-hmm.
It was basically, if you're not working on the farm or in the fields, you're studying the Bible. That is it. Storytelling was not a thing, and this will make sense why I'm bringing this up later. But all of the fun of life, I mean, they had no electricity, right? So, lights out and you're going to bed once the fire burns out.
Yeah.
And they're in this new world. Everything is harsh. The summers are humid and hot. They're not used to heat. They're from England, right? It doesn't really get hot there. And then these winter storms would come in, which New Englanders will lovingly call nor'easters. They're not used to the weather. They're not used to anything that's happening with their bodies. So the second and third generations of these children born over there are bored out of their minds, right? But they're also extremely and intensely brought into this world of everything is very God and Bible based. So when someone would do something which would be considered a sin, or even something that is considered off-putting to someone else, they didn't quietly talk about it together. They didn't say, hey, Kat, the other day, when you came over, you didn't bring bread and you said you would. What they did is they would take each other out to the public square and they would scream to everyone what happened. So everything was public, because that was their way of quelling any gossip, right? Because gossip is not allowed per the Bible. So we're talking, if a couple got into a little argument, they went out to the middle of the town square and told everybody about it. And then if it was a punishable offense, everybody knew about it and everybody got to see the whipping or whatever the punishment would be. So this is very, I think the kids nowadays would call it everybody's info is on blast, right?
Yeah.
It's not a fun time. Everything is very serious.
You have no privacy.
None. None. Can you imagine what happens? Like, you and your husband get in a little tiff over, the marmalade being low.
Yeah.
And you have to go to the town square and go tell everybody about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're admonished as a female because you should have had what your husband wanted.
Yep.
Yeah. We've come a long way, is all I'm saying. Bear with me.
Oh, no kidding. Yeah.
Taking a moment. So what ends up happening is you have all these different families, and a couple of them have been there for 1 or 2 generations, but everyone's in a land grab, right? So they're trying to get land, but it's not just land for land's sake. It's, I want the good land, the land that I can raise livestock on, that I can raise crops in, because not all of the dirt over there is great. It's very rocky soil. And then it's close to the port, which is by the ocean. So you have salt going in the soil, which makes things not grow the best. If you do not put salt in soil, people, please. I understand if you are a fellow witch, sometimes we want to salt the corners, but it kills everything. Don't do it. There's my witch tip for the day for gardening.
That's a new show, JJ's Witch Tip of the Day.
Yeah, that's going to be a real weird long show. So. I got 4 tips. That's one of them. So you have this whole situation where all of this pressure is on everyone, and people, whether they're diehard Christians or not, people are people at the end of the day. Yep. And you have some people who get real angsty and want what someone else has, even though it's a sin to covet what someone else owns, right? They're still doing it, but they're trying to be sneaky and get around the rules. So they start suing each other. Now, mind you, everyone is under the crown still at this point, because this is still controlled by England, but obviously they're across the pond, shall we say. So they're trying to do these little subvert things to each other without getting the monarchy involved and without getting the government involved.
Mm-hmm.
So there are these little lawsuits. Oh, you let your livestock eat on my land, so I'm suing you and I want a part of your land now, or I want money. And this is going on all over the town, back and forth. And it's these 3 families in particular that it starts with. And basically, these 3 families keep trying to sue everyone for their stuff, and they're getting nowhere. Their lawsuits are frivolous, and they're getting thrown out, or everyone basically comes together and says, you need to stop it. You're being absurd. So we fast forward a little bit, and these guys get together and they say, you know what we need in town? We don't need everyone doing Bible study at home. We need a pastor. And so instead of just hiring a pastor at a church and having people tithe to the church as you do, they enforced a tax on everyone in the township to pay for this pastor, not only give up part of their land for his home, but to also give up their cut wood, their food, and money to have this pastor in town. So already this went over like a turd in a punch bowl because people were not thrilled, right?
What a great saying.
I'll thank my grandpa for that. So people are not happy already, because before, worshiping and the Bible was something you did at home, and people got together in groups, right, to honor the Sabbath, to do this. They've never had a pastor before. So this is already a concept they're not keen with. And the people bringing it up are the guys who are suing everyone. So not super popular. So this gets passed, and people start begrudgingly giving the pastor the wood, but then times get tough. They have a really rough and wet spring leading into summer. The summer, there's almost a drought. Things are dried out. Wood's getting hard to cut. It's not burning right. And it's kind of every man for themselves. So this is setting the scene for, it's a perfect storm what happens next, okay? So basically, this pastor is getting upset that people aren't giving him what he considers his due. And he starts telling the men who hired him, something's got to be done about this. And they're like, well, we've sued everyone 6 ways from Sunday, and no one's giving up their land and money to us either. Yep. So we're mad too. So they start conspiring of how they can start suing or just going in and taking people's stuff for themselves. So this becomes this very messy plot. Well, enter in the children of the pastor. And the children of the pastor just so happen to hear their parents talking about this. And their nanny, basically, named Tituba, who was brought over as a slave from Barbados. Now, if you don't know about island life is very rich with folk tales and stories. That's how people conveyed things. They were not used to this puritanical lifestyle. So this girl became a slave when she was 12. So she's already lived a decent part of her life, because, you know, women only live to be 40 or 50 at those points. Most died in childbirth. And so she had already lived a fairly good portion of her life in the islands, being around storytelling and folklore and voodoo and hoodoo and witchcraft and the stories, right? Because those entertained people on lonely nights. So she starts telling the kids these stories. And the kids concoct a fun idea. Oh, we can help out our dad, the pastor, and dad's friends, and get all these people to pay us stuff. We're going to call witchcraft. Isn't that
so much greed?
So much. It's confounding how this went as long as it did. So these children, they're between ages 9 and 12 years old. Suddenly, they start having these fits, as they call them, where they would lay down on the ground and start kicking their arms and feet, kind of like a tantrum, we would call it. But they would be uttering nonsense, and then they would wake up from these kind of disoriented, and then they'd say, so and so is a witch. She's vexing me with spectral. And listen, if you're like me and you hear the word spectral evidence, you're thinking, like she's a ghost. So what these kids started saying is that different people in town who weren't paying their dues were witches because they were what we would call in today's terms astral projecting to these children and pinching them on their hands and arms, and then causing them to scream and run all about the house and town. Now, again, remember, kids were not allowed to have fun. Kids weren't able to scream and yell. They're not able to go play. They're not able to do any of that. So
they should be seen and not heard.
Exactly.
Yep.
So this was like a perfect license for these kids to get on board with this, because this was fun finally. This is what kids do. Kids want to have fun, right? This is why you need playtime and other kids. So these kids start with, first they accuse Tituba, and they say, well, she's a witch. And because there were the witch trials already happening over in the UK at this point, there was the Malleus Malefictorium, which had also been out. That was the book called The Witch's Hammers in the 1400s. There was a witch craze because everyone became super Christian and there's witches everywhere. And over in the UK, a lot of it was used as a land grab as well. And so this became a popular way to get what you want. Just accuse the local townsperson of witchcraft, and they'll either A, give you whatever you were asking for, or B, they'll be moved out of the way because the sentence for witchcraft is death.
Yep.
So, any questions so far, Kat?
No. I just want to make one comment. I find it kind of fascinating when they would say to people, we'll figure out if you're a witch. I think they used to tie bricks or stones to their feet and throw them in the water. And if you did not surface and you drowned, well, obviously you were not a witch. But if you surface, obviously you're a witch. So it's like, what? Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
All of the tests were like this. There was another thing that they would do, and you're gonna just enjoy this. I'm sure your listeners are just going to love this. Warning, if you have children in the room, you might want to mute this for a moment. Basically, what they would do is they would make the person undress in front of either the township or the judges, which were usually all men, and typically witches were females. They would make them undress completely and then head to toe inspect them for what they called the devil's nipple. And the devil's nipple was not a third nipple like a lot of people like to think. It was birthmarks.
Yep.
How many of you right now have a birthmark on your body?
I have lots of them.
And if you have moles, even worse, because moles are definitely.
Right? Yeah.
So, I mean, it gets weirder and weirder as we go along in this. And as I started discussing, like studying this harder and harder, I was just like, how, but again, we've come a long way. So this is already happening over in the UK. It's spreading into Europe. There's witches being burned over there. And, they're still getting news, right, from the UK and from Europe. So they're hearing about this. And in my opinion, they concocted this very convenient story. And these kids ran with it. Well, once other children in town started seeing these kids being able to run around and have fun, and everyone's taking them seriously, they start hopping into it. And it was extremely convenient that the first 5 people who were accused of witchcraft were all people that most of the town folk wanted out of the way. Now, Tituba was accused. She wasn't accused until a little bit later, though. Bridget Bishop was one of the first who was accused. And the really sad thing about this is, more than likely, she was an abused woman. She, pretty much everyone knew it, that her first husband had passed away. She got married again. They did not have a great relationship. They were constantly in the middle of the town having to yell out what was going on. He was always accusing her of not being a great wife or whatever his mood of the day was. And she was having to go through public whipping or having the, red X of shame put on her back and rolled around with a mule in town. And she would constantly show up to people's homes with open wounds or bruises on her. So it was very, if you put the puzzle pieces together, more than likely she was an abused woman. And of course, women were considered property back then, so it's not like she could leave.
Cattle had more value than women.
Yes, they did. And goats and sheep and pigs and sometimes chickens, depending. So in this instance, we already have a woman that she makes people feel awkward when she's around, for the mere fact that they know she's being abused, but no one can talk about it, right? Because in their minds, that's just what happens. Women deserve it. You should be a better wife. You should be taking care of him. Whether you have an opinion or not, you need to keep it to yourself, because if it's not in the Bible, right, then we allow it to happen. And so when she would show up, the other women were a little weary of her because everyone wanted to say something, but they couldn't. And they made them feel bad. She also knew a lot about female reproductive systems. And so she wasn't considered a midwife, but she was pretty much a midwife. And when people would have miscarriages, because again, a lot of these people are, marrying cousins and stuff like that, she was knowing enough as to why they weren't carrying to term. And she also knew certain herbs that could help, or positions that women could do to have a boy versus a girl, things of that nature. So automatically the deck's stacked against her. She makes people feel weird. No one wants to talk about it. And then she knows too much. She's a woman, so she's a witch, obviously. So she was a good target. And again, she had a lot of land, and it was nice, fertile land that people needed. So getting her out of the way was extremely convenient for other people, including her husband, who kind of wanted to be rid of her. Now, remember, divorce was not an option back then. So very, very convenient. And the evidence against her was, again, these kids saying that she would randomly and for no reason astral project to them or send a mimic and would pinch them on their hands and arms or make them say bad words.
There is a lot of stupid people on this show.
That's enough proof.
I just, yeah. So we've got her, and then along comes Tituba, who she's being accused, and she doesn't fit in. She's a slave. She doesn't look like everyone else. She doesn't really fit in with these people. She's considered the help. And these kids are saying she's telling us these stories about witchcraft, which she was. She was trying to keep the kids entertained. And she goes in, and immediately what they do is when they bring you in on the charges, they pretty much start torturing you immediately, saying you need to admit that you are a witch. And if you say, I'm not a witch, then they torture you more because you have to admit that you're a witch. And you need to accuse 2 to 3 other people in town of being a witch, because this makes total sense, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully people will appreciate the entrapment laws a little bit more after hearing this. So Tituba goes in there. She's maybe 17 to 19 years old. She's not that old.
Yeah.
And she's scared out of her mind. It's not
Yeah.
like she has a family waiting for her. I mean, she's on another continent from where she came from. She's not going to be able to find her way back to Barbados on her own. So she ends up saying, okay, fine, I'm a witch. And yeah, these other people are witches too. How convenient, again, is it that she worked for one of the families who wanted certain people to be accused? So again, it feels like a setup. So then we have multiple others, and then it just became a three-ring circus because the kids now, I mean, there's almost 20 children at this point that are involved. And what they would do is they would sit in court and they would line all the kids up on the pews, because court was basically where they held church. And they would sit all these kids on pews next to each other. And then they would say, children, is this the witch? And they would have someone stand up. And then one kid would start, and all the kids would start mimicking each other or repeating back whatever this person said. If the person said, no, I'm not a witch, all the kids in unison would say, no, I'm not a witch. And then they'd all start flailing and, screaming, and just the drama of it all was just a lot. But again, no one's thinking kids will be kids. They're taking this seriously. So then all the clothes come off, and then they're searched for that. And then it's more torture. And because this is a township, this is not even a full town. It's small. They don't have a full-on jail. They have basically a basement where they're putting all of these women and shackling them to the wall. I want you to think about that. Okay? There's rats, there's mold, and it's dark. No one can move. And so they're going to the bathroom pretty much right where they're all sitting. And they're all in a giant room together, and no one is listening to their screams. And then a couple people, now that a lot of the widows, right, and those that are more poor in the area, that made them feel bad, because this one woman in particular would come around and she would ask for money for food, or can you give me some food, or let me inside so that I can sit by your fire and warm up. And she had a 7-year-old daughter. No one wanted to let her in because everyone's fighting for their own stuff. So she would call them out publicly. Thanks so much for being a good Christian and not giving me bread or not letting me warm up. Well, immediately she goes in, but she has a 7-year-old daughter and no one's taking her in. So now there's a 7-year-old orphan roaming around the streets, hiding in people's basements and trying like a mouse. She's going to look for food. And then they accuse the 7-year-old daughter.
Oh, wow.
It just keeps piling up, where one after the other, they're going after the widows, because if there's no man involved, they can take their property and seize it. So once the poor people were gone, the people with the really good properties were out of the way, and the widows, they started to go after the husbands of the wives that were already accused. Because if we get the husbands too, now we can take the land. So around this point, some people start waking up to this, because they accuse a very well-standing woman in town. And people start saying, this isn't right. This is ludicrous. And my relative, Elizabeth, the reason why she was accused is coming out of the first or second trial. I forget which one. Or sorry, it was the first. It was Bridget's trial. As she's walking out, everyone's leaving the courthouse because they've condemned her to death now. As she's walking out, she says very loudly, why are we listening to children with these ridiculous accusations? I've known Goody Bishop, because they didn't call each other Miss and Mrs. It was Goody or Good, right? I've known Goody Bishop my whole life, and she's never harmed a soul and only helped everyone. And the kids hear it. So she's a witch. And that's
Yep.
how my relative ended up being accused. Giles, everyone, for the most part, everyone who was accused and sentenced to death, which was almost all of them, were hung. They did not do the fire thing in America, probably because they didn't want to waste the wood at this point, is what I've come up with. So they would do a very public hanging. Giles Gorey, who was a male, when he was accused, he was sentenced because he held out and said, I'm not a witch. They basically laid large stones on him. So they laid him on the ground on top of rocks, put a board over him and large boulders to make him confess, and let him sit outside for 3 days in the winter during day and night with no food or water, asking him constantly, will you admit that you're a witch? And his final words were, more weight, please.
Yep.
And there is a wonderful podcast called If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything. And the host is Alan Bishop, and that is his direct descendant.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's
so
pretty
when
cool.
It is. When I first heard him talk, I thought, oh, if I met him, I would call him brother and he would know what that meant. And then when we found this out about each other, I laughed. And I said, we're probably related at this point.
Yeah.
So fun how all that works out.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
anybody who's being tortured, after a while, the majority of them will just confess. While there's still going to be a few of them that are stubborn enough to say, no, like you said, more weight, please. I just can't imagine that.
Is it? I mean, it's so wild to me. And honestly, to most anyone listening to this, you're going to think like, who would have gone through with this? But again, because the way that everything was a perfect storm, everything worked in these guys' favor. And people were calling them out right and left. They were saying, we know you're doing this deliberately, but they couldn't prove it because everyone was afraid of witchcraft, right?
Yep.
That was the big old crazy thing. So there are a lot of theories as to why this all occurred. And first and foremost, let me tell you, this is America's first conspiracy, because what ended up happening is towards the end, 18 people had already died. The governor comes to visit. Now, remember, the governor, they didn't want anybody reporting because the governor reported directly to the crown. So the governor comes and he has a very beautiful wife. And of course, he's a governor, right? So he has money and she has beautiful dresses. And so they come into town and the kids basically didn't like her, right? Because the girls are now starting to get to the age where, you know, we need men looking at us to be a wife. And this woman comes in and all eyes are on her because not only is she pretty, but she has fancy clothes. They've never had fancy clothes. They don't have fancy anything. So she comes into town with the governor and she's just sitting there, like probably just sitting there, probably doing nothing actually, because women weren't allowed to do anything. And they accused her. So as this governor is getting this update, okay, how are these witch trials going? Like, all right, I get it. On the back end, the kids start accusing her of being a witch. So the next day, knock at the governor's door, and he finds out your wife has been accused. And at that point, he went ballistic and shut everything down, and everything stopped. They did have one more hanging, unfortunately, before that. And what they did is they went house to house, because back then you didn't have just one court reporter who sat and took notes. There wasn't much to do. So everyone took notes and everyone had a private journal or diary.
Mhm.
And they went house to house and confiscated everyone's journals or diaries
Oh.
about the trials, because the governor realized, oh my God, we've been listening to children and we just killed 19 people,
Mhm.
most of whom were adults and, all paying a lot of taxes to the crown. I'm going to get chewed out for this. So probably best we make this go away.
Yep.
So that's why the few transcripts that we have and journals that we have on this are so important, because so much of it was confiscated. It's
Mhm.
not like they had cameras back then, right?
Yep.
So we've got the government trying to shut this all up. And then we have the 3 families who were involved, including the preacher. They're all trying to shut this up because they don't want people thinking they're the bad guys, because they're very clearly the bad guys in all of this. But there are a couple other things that are very curious. Now, I had mentioned that they had a very wet spring before and a very harsh summer. And that can lead to a perfect recipe when you're growing wheat and grain of ergot. And it's a very special kind of purple mold, basically. And back then, these people were hungry. They're starving, right? If the crop goes bad, salvage what you can. So there are some thought processes, because when someone consumes ergot, it's basically like LSD. It causes hallucinations, but because the children are small and malnourished, it can also cause seizure-like fits and tics. And this is a lot of the things that these children were showing, right, on public display, which makes sense, because if everyone's wheat had some ergot on it, some more than others, and these kids were eating the bread, which is the main staple of their diet, potentially all of them were rolling on acid. So
they're all tripping.
yes, that was the word I was looking for. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, you've got that. You also have, there are some people, I mean, just to state the obvious, a lot of these people were inbred. And when that goes down a couple generations, some of the kids are going to come out and they're going to have little things that are a little off with them. And that can also cause some awfulness, and it can cause giant imaginations and them to act out of turn, which is maybe why these children were acting so weird compared to how they normally would act. But again, because everything turned on a dime and it was very convenient, I'm still leaning towards it was a land grab. Just saying. I'm not using my psychic skills on this, but
it's like that saying, I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens.
Exactly. Get me, girl. So, the real thing for me is you have all these people who are making these accusations. Oh, they're evil. They're a witch. In reality, those people, I feel, were the evil ones.
Definitely.
Because they did this maliciously. They did it with the intent to hurt other people. They did it for selfish reasons.
Yep.
And that's the awful part of all of this, is that 19 people died in front of the entire town, their own families. And being hung is, I mean, it's not like, oh, your neck breaks and you're dead. Most people, no, it's not pretty. It's not. And I'm sorry that that's a bit crass to go there, but I think it needs to be said, because it's one thing to think, okay, someone's burned at the stake. That is purely awful. But the only good part of that is most people die from smoke inhalation before they actually have the physical pain, right? When you're hung and your neck doesn't break just right, you're basically choked to death. And of course, they bind their hands and then they put a bag over their head. And in some cases, they didn't put the bag over the head. They learned how to do that real quick, because unfortunately, when your neck is constricted, certain parts of your face bug out.
It's not pretty to
And
watch.
that was a bit much for people. Not
Yeah.
the death part, but the bugging out of the eyes was
Right.
too much.
Yeah.
My God.
So it's pretty much greed and murder, really.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I find, yes, this is harsh reality. It's horrible what people went through back then, but it is still part of history. And I think it's important for people to know, no matter how bad it is.
It is. And the main reason why it's taught in school is because it was a huge turning point for the legal system at that point. And as a result of it being such a large turning point, it changed some laws once it was absolutely found out. Now, the laws changed over on our part, but it didn't change over in Europe for a good long while. Now, the United States of America finally in 2022 exonerated all 19 of the people who were hung for witchcraft, and including the other, I think, 12 that were accused and then let go when the governor stepped in and said, just let everyone go. Like, we're just going to bury this.
I didn't actually know that. 2022,
Yeah.
you said?
2022. Yeah.
Wow.
Took a while for them to get.
No kidding. Yeah.
Yeah. So their criminal records were scrubbed, 400 something years after they had died. Thanks. I'm sure they really care about that now, but at least legally it's on the record and it sets precedent for going forward with different legal cases. Now, that being said, did you know that the last person convicted of witchcraft, what year do you think that happened?
It's probably a lot later than I think. Within my lifetime? Oh, wow. What year?
So in Canada, the last conviction for witchcraft was 1993.
Wow. Do you know where in Canada?
It was in Quebec. The conviction was upheld by the Court of Appeal because the trial judge was able to infer that there was fraudulent intent on the accused behalf. Because basically what happened is there was a person who was going around and was saying that they were psychic and they could talk to the dead, and they were unfortunately bilking people for a lot of money. And it was pure fraud that they were doing. It wasn't, an actual service. But guess what year Canada decided to repeal the law that this person was convicted under? The witchcraft law.
Oh.
Just guess. Just
I don't
guess,
know.
girl. 2000.
I don't know. I'm just throwing that out of my butt.
2018.
18.
Yeah. 6 beautiful years ago, Canada's law against pretending to practice witchcraft was repealed. Now, police do still persecute and prosecute people who, quote unquote, use the dark arts to fraudulently take money from people. But again, it's very hard to prove that unless there's like a concerted effort.
The workaround is a lot of people will say they are Reiki, they practice Reiki and things like that. So that way they're not accused as a witch.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, again, according to the Puritans, y'all witches.
Yeah.
You're listening to this, you're a witch. Moles, nipples or not.
That could be the title of the episode. Moles, nipples or not.
Okay.
Not really.
Sure, the sponsors are going to love that one. So So in Scotland in 1944, Helen Duncan was one of the last people to be tried under the Witchcraft Act. And the reason I bring this up is because it just shows that still within the last 100 years, we've been having this go on. And I will get to America last because this one is a doozy, girl. Like, I'm going to have to bend your ear on this. Still mad. So Helen Duncan basically was accused and for the same thing. She was a spiritualist. She had been doing this since the early 1920s, though. Back then, she said she was a clairvoyant medium and she would hold seances. So people would pay money to come to the seances. And she said she would be able to conjure ectoplasm. And there was a photographer, Harvey Metcalf, who photographed her doing this at one of the seances. There are people to this day who still do this. I was invited to one last year. I declined. I had 2 friends who went and they said, don't know how to explain it, but like, apparently they put some things out on the table and then everyone sits around. But here's why it's weird to me, because you and I think of a seance, we think there's a couple candles lit, right? We're holding hands around the table. These seances are held in pitch black rooms. Okay. You with me?
Oh, yeah.
They cover the windows so no moonlight can even get in. And no one can move. So everyone has one leg Velcroed to a chair so that if you try to get up and move, everyone can hear the Velcro.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Except for the person conducting the seance. Isn't that convenient?
Oh, yeah.
And
that's convenient.
It is. And so on the table, they have a couple items. There's like chalk dust and like a little ball and a couple other things. And so one of the people I know who went, they said, well, it's hard to explain it, but when the lights came on, I had a white chalk handprint on my leg. And one other person said that they had felt something on the back of their neck and the like little ball was found in the nape of their sweatshirt. And I'm thinking, okay, but again, like if you have someone with just the right padded shoes, and the ectoplasm stuff, I don't even know what that would look like. That just sounds gross to me at this point.
I mean, anybody dressed in complete black with, the proper shoes, like you said, could just go behind someone. How? Okay, keep going.
It's fine. It is what it is. But poor Helen back in 1944, she had been doing this. She had made a pretty penny. Like she was self-sufficient in the 20s, 30s, and 40s in Scotland. That's rough. Yeah. But she had been investigated multiple times. People were finding her saying she was a fraud. And then finally she was one of the last people to be tried under the Witchcraft Act. And she was sentenced to 9 months in prison for her conviction.
Wow.
1944. World War II was happening for reference, and yet they had time to focus on this. So Helen was a big deal, apparently.
Wow.
Are you ready to talk about what happened in America?
Yes. Give it to me, sister.
All right, hon, because this... I watched an entire documentary about this. Again, learned more about my lovely family history. So back when Germans started migrating to the Americas, they formed communities. And for whatever reason, they called themselves the Pennsylvania Dutch. And some of them, German, Netherlands, whatever, but they all spoke kind of the same language. And so they were labeled as the Pennsylvania Dutch. And what a lot of people don't know is that they had healers and what we would call witches or energy workers who were given a gift, and they called it powwow magic. Now, this gets a little dicey, right? Because a lot of people, when they hear the word powwow, they think of Native Americans, because that was something people used to say, right? The powwows. And that is a Native American term, and that is something. But this word was used in Europe for years before anyone came to the Americas and talked to the native peoples here. So isn't that interesting that one word means something somewhat similar 2 continents away? I'm just bringing that up. Again, I think we were a global civilization at one time, and people just don't want to remember that. But that's just me. So powwow healers were people who could, and one of the terms is lay hands. They could put their hands and heal an affliction, whatever it may be. And there were times when they would have to do herbal work, and sometimes a little more than just laying hands. It would be like a process, what I would call spell work, right? But they would call it like a process. And in some of these, this was handed down from generation to generation. Now, again, I mentioned my heritage with this. I know that on my father's side, that my great-great-grandmother was a powwow healer. And apparently she lived in Ohio, and she was very well known, so well known that the native people in her area would actually bring her sick to her.
Oh, wow.
Which was very rare back then, because not everyone got along. We'll just put it that way. Okay.
Yeah.
Especially, in the 1800s, right? Like, I'm being very light with how I'm delicately glossing over this. But you all know what I mean. It was not a pretty time. But that's how much trust that she had earned and how kind she was. She would work with anyone. If you needed help, that was fine. And the story is my grandpa was about 12 when she was sick and going to pass. And she had told him, come see me and I will show you what it is that I do and imbue you with the gift. And he tried to get there in time, but she had passed. And so he, quote unquote, never received the gift. But my father did, even though it wasn't physically given. So I had already known that these hands-on healers existed. I just didn't know that they were called powwow healers. Right?
That's new for me too.
Well, Google it. There's some really great documentaries about it on YouTube and some streaming services for anyone out there. It's spelled the same way, Powwow. Same way. So back in 1928, I need just a moment with this, because this case it's rough. I'm just going to let you all know, okay? As much as the Salem Witch Trials irk me, this one, there was a wonderful man named Nelson Riemeyer, okay? Nelson was a powwow healer. He had a home. It wasn't in town. It was kind of right out of town, like about a half day's journey. So if you were to go see him, if you needed his services, which everyone knew about him, by the way, because he was really good. But if you needed to go see him, more than likely you're going to end up spending the night at his house, because the journey back would be at night and it would be too dangerous, right? Because again, not everyone had cars back then, especially in this part of Pennsylvania, New York. This is the area that it was in, kind of in the sticks a little bit.
JJ, not that I want to rush you, but we have one more minute until we have to sign off already. We'll have to have a two-parter.
What?
Yeah, I know.
Oh.
We'll have to have a two-parter, yeah. So,
Okay.
Yeah. Did you want to call it there? And then you can
I'll
tell
call
the listeners and viewers where they can find you?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes, JJROSE777 across the board. Kat, I'll be back with you to talk about Nelson in the future.
Definitely. Very soon too. Yeah, I hated to cut you off, but yeah.
I didn't know we had a time limit. I'm so
Yeah,
sorry.
no, I apologize. I totally forgot to tell you about that.
Okay.
It's on me.
Love
I'm
you.
sorry.
That's fine.
Thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate you. And much love to you and your family. We'll
You too,
talk to you
Kat.
again very soon.
Thank you.